this is a time that people like to celebrate. And what does that look like back in the 1860s? What does that look like in a time of war? So that's what I thought we would look at. Specifically the holiday season in the Rappahannock Valley in 1862. So Christmas and the holiday season is obviously a very special time of year for so many people. It's a sentimental time. It's a time for gathering with friends and family, and those people that are close to us. It's a time that's often been portrayed as gift-giving, inviting festive trees into our house that we can adorn with more ornaments, Christmas lights, caroling, feasting. And in 1862, Americans North and South needed that more than ever. Christmas was was much more demonstrative, I should say, in the South than it was in the North. The first state to officially proclaim Christmas a holiday, anybody know?
Louisiana.
Louisiana, exactly. Yeah, they did that in 1830. Many of the states followed after Louisiana's start. The South had a particularly paternalistic way of looking at the holiday seasons, but it was also a time that could be rather pervasive with fear for an entire segment of the population. It was a time for enslaved people to theoretically take a break and have festivities of their own, but it was also a time that they actually had more work for enslaved people because they were preparing elaborate meals and preparing for parties and gatherings and all sorts of festivities for white Southerners. It was also a time that they did see enslaved people get short respites. It was a time for the annual clothing allotment that was given out. It was a time for a different type or more expansive food than they would have ordinarily seen. It was a time to share spirits. And it was a time that was granted to them almost like a special dispensation by plantation owners. It was a time when enslaved people could gain permission from their enslavers to marry, to travel, to visit, and to be reunited with their families and loved ones. But it was also a time when enslaved people were expected to be grateful and to be enthusiastic for their patricians. In another sense, it was also one of the most dangerous times of the year for enslaved people, because a large segment of the white population feared that the enslaved population moving between plantations, also allowed people to gather, and that could start with slave revolts. As a result, the holiday season also saw a huge uptick in militia units being activated and slave patrols. And this is a good example of what that might have looked like at Christmas time. If you didn't have a pass, you were in big, big trouble. In the North, Christmas appeared to be a little bit more subdued. In colonial times, Puritans had tried to purge the holiday of what they considered its Anglican extravagances. They said that distracted individuals from communing with God and His Word. Massachusetts in colonial times literally fined people for ostentatious celebrations of Christmas. It eased somewhat with the influx over time of immigrants and the pluralistic society in various faiths that were expressed in the North. But still, the notion of the holidays as being a time of austere reflection and fasting prevailed in many of the rural areas throughout the North even as late as the 1860s. Even at the time of the Civil War, people were expected to work on Christmas Day, and students were expected to go to school. Still, the holidays were making considerable inroads into American culture by the 1850s and 60s. Many of the country's traditions were already starting to be put in place in the years leading up to the Civil War. The notion of exchanging presents, winter dances, special seasonal foods and festivities, a festive evergreen tree, and a jolly old gift-giving elf named St. Nicholas, or Father Christmas, or Santa Claus. The latest fashionable songs included Jingle Bells, which was made in 1857, and Up on the Rooftop in 1860. The Civil War altered how much we perceived the Christmas season and how it became ingrained as part of the American holiday tradition. In 1861, Christmas was a challenge for many Americans who found themselves separated from family and friends for the very first time in their lives. Still, soldiers had the comfort that they were not entirely away from home, but they still had family around them for the most part. Many soldiers joined up with family members in 1861, and most of them were together at this time of the season. The only separation was with the people back home. And both the men in the field and the loved ones at home cherished the notion that they would soon be reunited. So this was just a momentary inconvenience. Families sent loved ones care packages to remind them of home, and that included numerous delicacies, which more often than not spoiled before delivery. But the sentiment was far more important than actually the cakes. Soldiers spent that first Christmas mostly reminiscing about past Christmas feasts and looking forward to being home soon and renewing their traditions next year. And then in 1862, Christmas became a little bit more challenging. As the year passed, there was no end in sight for this war. Over 160 years ago, this very day, the armies left this area and started moving to Fredericksburg. And that would lead to a cataclysmic battle in December, on December 13th. That put a startling mark on this holiday for so many people. Not only the people of Fredericksburg, but the people of Culpeper County. For the people around the country. What happened in Fredericksburg reverberated across this entire continent and affected families from Maine to Mississippi. Civilians of the town of Fredericksburg had become refugees, and many had no homes to return to after December 1862. Confederate soldiers and civilians from across the South actually raised a subscription of money to help the citizens of Fredericksburg recover from the hard hand of war. And still, many of the Fredericksburg natives never came back. Many families prepared bravely for another holiday season separated from their husbands and fathers, brothers, and loved ones. And many of them were oblivious to what had happened in Fredericksburg until the news was brought to them. There would be many a vacant chair this season that would remain vacant forever. A Union soldier in the Irish Brigade lamented that this would be a very poor Christmas by many an Irish hearthstone, where wives had suddenly found themselves widows and children suddenly had become orphans. Union armies were on the march all across the South, not just in Fredericksburg, but in Tennessee, heading from Nashville to Murfreesboro, in the Mississippi Valley, heading towards Vicksburg, in the Trans-Mississippi, heading to Chickasaw Bayou. Lincoln had pushed every one of his field armies forward simultaneously that winter, anxious to see victory on the eve of releasing the Emancipation Proclamation. So armies under Ambrose Burnside and Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman and William S. Rosecrans, all of them went forward that winter. And 3 of them lost, and lost badly. And one of them had a Pyrrhic victory that left it paralyzed and unable to exploit its battle for another 6.5 months. This was not only the holiday season, but it was the countdown to a new year, but it was also the countdown to a new war and a new world, with the Emancipation Proclamation changing the focus of not only the war, but the country and its path. Ambrose Burnside failed miserably at Fredericksburg, and his defeat was probably more spectacular than anybody else's. The Confederates lost about 5,000 men at Fredericksburg. The Union Army lost almost 3 times that. 13,000 Union soldiers lost, and nothing to show for their efforts. This was the most dramatic one-sided victory that Robert E. Lee had ever had against his opponent. What does a battlefield look like in the aftermath? What does Cedar Mountain look like in the aftermath here? The dead, the wounded? What does that feel like at a highly emotive time of year when people are drawn together as family? This was a time of intense human suffering. And it made it very hard for those to differentiate between those who were winning and those who were losing. A soldier recalled, "The sadness which prevails throughout the whole army that night can never be described nor imagined. Dead not only littered the battlefield, they covered it. One Confederate counted 484 bodies in just 1 acre. William W. Blackford of Jeb Stuart's staff recorded the ground was blanketed with Union dead, and it looked as blue as if it had been covered with a blue cloth," he said. A South Carolina soldier wrote home, "I have never seen men lay so thick as they did on the outskirts of the city. In one little garden, not more than 2/3 of an acre, there were 147 lying dead, and all over the city they were lying dead." The nature of their deaths also gave the soldiers pause. A member of the 53rd Georgia Infantry wrote home, "You can't imagine what a horrible spectacle I witnessed. I saw hundreds of men lying dead, shot in all parts, and some with their heads, legs, arms, etc., shot off and mangled in all manner and shapes." But the dead were beyond suffering. The real harrowing tale follows with the wounded. A staff officer admitted, "I went through a hospital witnessing amputations and seeing wounds and wounded men almost without number. I have never seen the like before, and I hope never to see it again." A Union witness concluded that the surgeons were the only ones who were not oppressed by sadness. He wrote, "The surgeons were the happiest of all because they were so busy, they had no time to think of our terrible losses." Men filled houses and barns and slave quarters and Sibley tents Fractured human beings were transported to hospitals in Richmond, in Charlottesville, Lynchburg, Stanton, but also Washington, Georgetown, Annapolis, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Civilians, north and south, with perhaps the exception of only the people of Fredericksburg, had not experienced war in its most potent and consuming violence. Seeing the wounded was their only tie to their own loved ones still in the service. And it was truly frightening to be confronted with disfigured individuals, crippled in the prime of their lives, that could easily be their loved ones. Even soldiers in the army deigned not to notice the wounded, but the home front had no choice. Soldiers insulated themselves from the consequences of war as best they could. They refused to dwell on death any longer than they had to. They dismissed the lame and the impaired from their midst and focused only on the healthy men who were still around them. A soldier from New York stated rather succinctly at this time, "On that day, hundreds bit the dust, but one gets used to such scenes quicker than you might think. Oh, it's tough, but it had to be so." What do you think of this image? What are you looking at?
Christmas wreaths on a casket.
It's a what?
It looks like Christmas wreaths.
There are Christmas greens all around.
Yeah.
This is a funeral.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is how Christmas was depicted by an artist. One Union sergeant in the Army of the Potomac was granted an extended furlough after Fredericksburg, provided he would carry the body of his dead captain home to his people. He attended the funeral and then abruptly departed on his own, not to go home, but to go back to the army and give up his furlough. Who does that? Who gives up a chance to be with their loved ones during the holidays? He found the grief of the captain's family too unsettling for him. And despite being surrounded on a daily basis with misery, uncertainty, and death, the sergeant confessed he didn't really know what war was. This is what he wrote. "Up to this time, I had not fully realized what war was. This was the first time I witnessed the great sorrow of friends at home over the loss of their sons and brothers killed in war, and it left an impression on my mind that I shall never forget. It haunted him to the point where the only people that he could feel safe and solaced by were the soldiers that were still in the army." Across the home front, families found their holidays altered. Women wrestled with managing a family and children without a partner. They experienced anxiety and grief, uncertainty and depression. They had heartache for lost or missing loved ones who had become even more acute as a feeling when you add in a holiday season that features family. One woman, Margaret Cahill, wrote to her soldier husband that she was nervous and lonely all the time. Children were given less gifts. The gifts tended to be more homemade gifts, or something simple like apples or oranges or popcorn balls. But gifts also took on a different tinge in the winter of 1862. Many of the gifts were militaristic and reflected the state of the society that they were living in. They were given toy swords and drums and bugles. They had kepis and uniforms, and even when they had snowball fights, they had snowball forts to fortify those positions. The paucity of gifts for children got even worse as the war went on. Parents started to warn their children not to count on Santa Claus, that Santa might not be able to find his way through the Union naval blockade of the South, that Santa was in fact a Yankee and had been detained by the Confederate pickets. And one very exasperated and highly insensitive parent informed her children that the Yankees had shot Santa Claus. Can you imagine? Now, some of that obviously smacked of propaganda. And nobody did propaganda about Christmas better than one particular person in America. That was Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast was a German illustrator who gave power to Christmas as propaganda. He was the man who created the modern incarnation of Santa Claus as we know him. But he also used the pages of Harper's to showcase Christmas and sacrifice during war. This is one of his images that you might be familiar with. This is a husband and wife under the same moon thinking about each other on Christmas Eve. What do you think of the sentiment in this sketch? Does it draw them together?
No.
Does it separate them?
Yeah.
It's hard to see, but between the two circles, between the soldier husband and the wife,
Tombstone.
is a cemetery. Yeah, having a graveyard there changes a lot of the story and feel for that, doesn't it? In another one of his sketches, he showed a family reunion that he titled Furlough, with a soldier coming home for the holidays. And happily, his little boy abandons his military presence to cling to his father. But notice the little girl over to one side. She's very uncertain at who this stranger is. And that is the product of fathers being complete strangers to their own flesh and blood when they went off to war. He gave us children hanging stockings and being visited by old St. Nick and romping and cavorting with their treasures. But he also created small vignettes that reflected some of the notions of visitation and play, but in different lights, where horses dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh are juxtaposed with artillery moving into position across a snowfield. So there are different lights that have to somehow coexist. Thomas Nast gave us Santa Claus visiting the Union Army, dispensing gifts boxes filled with scarves and socks, and showing a dancing puppet, which, if you take a closer look, is really Jefferson Davis. And he's hanged. So Christmas is now hanging the Confederate president. Parents put on a brave face, and they tried to celebrate, but confronted with the empty chair and the uncertainty of ever seeing loved ones again, or worse, the certainty of knowing that they will never see loved ones again, racked many with depression and despair for the future. Modest Christmas celebrations became synonymous with patriotic celebration. You were not supposed to be too festive because there were people in your community that had nothing to celebrate. so you were quiet and thoughtful. Soldiers, on the other hand, could be a bit raucous. They were desperate to claim some small part of their homes and their families and their traditions. And when they realized they're not going back to those things anytime soon, they tried to import them to where they existed. So they spent Christmas giving out small, modest gifts to friends. They went visiting, they ate together, and there was drinking. Union soldiers decorated Christmas trees with salt pork and hardtack. Soldiers fired salutes to Santa Claus. Some officers treated their men to special meals or gave out apples or pies. Men sang Christmas carols, including Jingle Bells and Up on the Rooftop. But the holidays largely missed the mark. What does this sketch tell you? Done by Alfred Wood. It's one man by a meager fire cooking a tiny piece of meat. It's titled The Christmas Meal. Doesn't look very festive, does it? Actually, looks rather lonely. The holidays largely missed the mark. A Union signal officer wrote home that Christmas was a dull day at our camp, and that he conceded that the Army as a whole, as a general thing, enjoyed itself very little. In fact, any revelry that could be had on Christmas Day was attributed, as one soldier said, to different commissaries issuing whiskey to all who would apply for it. And that was, quote, something unusual to soldiers. An officer wrote that the result of this whiskey was that the Army of the Potomac on the 25th was as drunk as an owl. Among the officers, whiskey punches flowed like rain, according to another. Captain John Fortescue of Pennsylvania detailed, I paid a visit to the headquarters of General Dan Sickles. Are you familiar with Dan Sickles? Mm-hmm. So what do you expect to find in Dan Sickles?
Stinking drunk.
Excess and stinking drunk. Very good. I paid a visit to the headquarters of General Dan Sickles in the evening of the 25th and found everybody, including the general, considerably elevated. They actually had to buck and gag a captain who got so furiously drunk that he drew his saber and came very near finishing off 2 or 3 of the gents at the party. Fortescue also noted, I also stopped at Hooker's or Fighting Joe's headquarters and found things in the same elegant condition, with the exception of the bucking and the gagging. The drum major of a Pennsylvania regiment found himself clapped into the guardhouse for getting drunk and sounding taps instead of tattoo. Another soldier informed the people back home, I am sorry to say, the party got beautifully inebriated. Very few of the party made their appearances the next day at roll call. Christmas 1862, when you hear about these excesses, you're not hearing about celebration, you're hearing about escapism. In fact, the holidays had mocked the soldiers who were still in the field and far from home, and it offered no promise that they were going to be going home anytime soon. They were going to be surrounded by battles and disease, and they still had a fresh, open wound right before them in Fredericksburg. And it had claimed so many of their comrades and family members that were no longer with them in 1862, that had been at Christmas 1861. Now they were gone, and the soldiers felt that loss keenly. The empty chair featured prominently at home, but it was also evident in the army, no matter how hard the soldiers struggled to ignore it. And that's why you're looking at a soldier who eats alone on his holiday. Soldiers wrote from their camps opposite Fredericksburg to the people back home. A New Jersey artilleryman said the result of the Battle of Fredericksburg was demoralizing to the entire army. Desertions are frequent and officers insubordinate, discipline slack. Men and officers have completely lost confidence in General Burnside. Even General Burnside recognized that. He said, "The Army has not been paid for several months, which caused great dissatisfaction among the soldiers and their friends at home, and increased the number of desertions to a fearful extent. And in short, there was much gloom and despondency throughout the entire command at that season." Some of the soldiers even turned Christmas into a protest. On Christmas Eve at 5 p.m., the Union Second Corps dressed ranks for a review. General Edwin Bowes Sumner, highly respected, rode down the ranks and he was met with vociferous cheering. But when Ambrose Burnside joined him, the cheering abruptly stopped. Sumner had to personally appeal to the Irish Brigade to cheer Burnside. So they made a second round, and the brigade obliged. But as Sumner's son-in-law put it, it was a marked difference in the cheering, and it was perceptible from what had been given to others. In the Confederate Army, the Yuletide was also led to a rather reflective and sorrowful time, but also a time of reaffirmation, determination. This is a soldier who's standing watch, alone. This is titled Christmas Day. Tally Simpson, a member of the 3rd South Carolina, wrote to his sister on Christmas morning. And this is what he wrote. "This is Christmas Day. The sun shines feebly through a thin cloud. The air is mild and pleasant, and a gentle breeze is making music through the leaves of the lofty pines that stand near our bivouac. All is quiet and still, and that very stillness recalls some sad and painful thoughts. This day, 1 year ago, how many thousand families, gay and joyous, celebrating Christmas, drinking health to absent members of their families, and sending upon the wings of love and affection long, deep, and sincere wishes for their safe return to their loved ones at home. But today are clad in the deepest mourning in memory to those lost and loved members of their circle who are not coming back. Add to this the cries and the wailings of mourners, the mothers and the fathers weeping for their sons, sisters for their brothers, wives for their husbands, and daughters for their fathers, scattering broadcast over the entire land. That's your Christmas morning reflection. Others ruminated more on missed opportunities to dote over their children. Philip H. Power of Jeb Stuart's headquarters wrote home, "I can and do wish you a happy day, and the same to our little dears, who I suppose must be content with very meager gifts and very few sweet things. I thought of them when I first awoke, and thus about day, and wondered, what have you managed to put in their stockings?" General William B. Tolliver wrote to his wife about his Christmas. "I spent a most quiet and uninteresting Christmas." But he had a feast. And how do generals eat? Pretty good, right? "I had nothing to eat," he said, "or to drink, but a large poor piece of beef and some cold water." Now, if a division commander eats that way. What are the folks in the division eating? A Confederate in Pickett's division received a letter from home saying their Christmas dinner at home was just simply mackerel, and that they thought that that was very bad. This soldier shared that his Christmas dinner was even worse. It was crackers and a bit of beef. He wrote in his letter, "Isn't it too hard to have to dine on the same old thing today that I've had for 7 or 8 months for past? You cannot imagine how it made my mouth water to read about mackerel." Now, there were some soldiers that fared pretty well. The ladies of Richmond sent the 1st Virginia Infantry a bounty of good things, and they shared some of that with their friends and neighbors. William H. Cobb of the 9th Virginia detailed his Christmas dinner. We had roast turkey, pig's head stew. Apparently that's a delicacy. Maybe an acquired taste. Baked shoots and middlings and turnips, and after claps, dried apple pudding. Still, Koch admitted that it just wasn't the same. If we had only been able to have a little eggnog, it would have seemed still a little bit more like Christmas. General William Mahone was a person who, as you might know, was very small and very diminutive. He had a tiny little waist. He had a very rigid diet. And after Christmas, or I should say after the Battle of Fredericksburg, he had a milk cow and specific chickens that were exclusively for his meals, and they were all stolen by Confederate soldiers. So for Christmas, he kept a pen set up right next to his tent to fatten up a group of chickens to replace the ones that were lost. A Virginian in his brigade wrote rationale that he was to leave those turkeys so exposed because Christmas morning, his turkeys were all gone again. So maybe eating with General Tolliver and his water would have been better. Drinking was a problem in Lee's army as well as the Union Army. Confederates in the 5th South Carolina admitted, "We had a terrible spree in camp one night during Christmas week, and the boys nearly all getting drunk and kicking up a terrible hurrah." One party of Virginians came up with a happy idea of stealing an officer's frock and sword and organized a so-called provost guard detail. Provost guard being the police of the army. They visited several Virginia brigades where they knew a black market industry was thriving selling whiskey to the soldiers. And under the pretense that they were, in fact, the provost guard from Longstreet's headquarters, they confiscated all the whiskey and brought it back to their own camp and had a great party. The men were so furiously drunk that their brigade commander, a man named Micah Jenkins, ordered the entire brigade out and to stand under arms to quiet them down. He then lashed at them with an address read to us, reprimanding us very severely for our drunken and disorderly conduct. Some Confederates and Federals engaged in another illicit trade, and that was across the Rappahannock, bartering tobacco for coffee and for the free exchange of newspapers and souvenirs. A.J. McBride of the 10th Georgia Infantry recalled, lively trafficking in tobacco, papers, magazines, coffee, etc. was carried on between them, and many a fishing frolic was held by both parties at this time. A Connecticut artilleryman noted on January 3rd, Our boys have been over in a boat and brought back some of the Rebs, and after a short conversation, carried them back again. But it is not allowed anymore. It was never allowed. Another Christmas party also relied on borrowed or bartered bounty. But this one wasn't stolen. It was donated by admirers. This became one of the most legendary parties of the Civil War. Anybody know what this building is?
Awesome.
It's Moss Neck, exactly. And Moss Neck was the headquarters for Stonewall Jackson during the winter of '62. According to Mariana Jackson, her husband, quote, had come into a bonanza of food from an endless array of admirers. So Jackson hosted a dinner party. And he invited Robert E. Lee, the Chief of Artillery, William Nelson Pendleton, the Chief of Cavalry, Jeb Stuart, and their staffs. And they all met in the office at Moss Neck. Generally, if you were going to look at a party from Stonewall Jackson, it probably would be the most tedious event you had ever endured in your life. He had no social skills whatsoever. Even his wife, who clearly loved him, admitted that when it came to small talk, Jackson was as exact as a multiplication table and full of things military as an arsenal. And that was his small talk. So when the generals gathered with Stonewall Jackson, the party was actually pretty staid. It almost became cliquish. People just sort of hung out. But little was engaged back and forth until Jeb Stuart showed up. Stuart changed everything. And he made a point of avoiding conversation with anybody when he came in, and in fact, spent his time walking around the office, pausing in front of pictures of racehorses and rat terriers and other betting animals. And as he examined these walls, he would turn around and glare at Stonewall Jackson until he had everybody's attention. And then Stuart accused Jackson of hanging these pictures, quote, to his personal taste, and that it indicated, quote, a great decline in his moral character, which would be a grief and a disappointment to the pious old ladies of the South. It is such an absolute ridiculous statement that everybody started laughing, including the general's own staff. The only person who didn't laugh was Stonewall Jackson. According to his staff, he just stood there dumbly and blushed like a schoolgirl. During the dinner itself, as everybody settled in to eat, Stuart again accused Jackson of setting the stage. He noted that all the pats of butter on the table had little fighting gamecocks on them. Again, a betting animal. And he announced as he spearwanted one of these that, behold the Jackson coat of arms, just for betting. Even Robert E. Lee started to get in on the fun, eyeing the waiters that served them in white aprons and white gloves. He told Jackson, "You, sir, are merely playing soldier." And in fact, he invited Jackson to come dine with me and see how real soldiers fare. Which is really kind of an interesting thing for Lee to say. See how real soldiers fare? Lee just busted a joke at Jackson's expense, but he also busted a joke at his own expense. Because Robert E. Lee was notoriously chintzy. When it came to paying for having an extra marquee for a dining tent for his staff, he didn't give them one. He didn't get the most choice food. So Lee's staff thought that he just wouldn't spend the money. They had a nickname for him behind his back that they didn't think he knew. They called him the Great Tycoon. But at this moment, Lee's letting you know he's very much aware of what his reputation is. And to him, it's not something to be upset about. It is something to make a joke at his expense and Jackson's. So this was a lively little experience at Moss Neck. This was probably the last great idol of the Army of Northern Virginia's High Command. These people would never meet again. Not totally. Jackson would be dead in just 5 months. Callie Simpson had written to his sister about Christmas and about how horrible it would be for the people that had lost their families. He finished his letter to his sister Anna. When will this war end? Will another Christmas roll around and find us all wintering in camp? Ugh. That peace may soon be restored to our young but dearly beloved country, and that we may all meet again in happiness. But enough of these sad thoughts. Philip H. Power of Stewart's headquarters, who wondered what his wife could possibly put in the children's stockings, went on to write, "Memory went back to the many happy Christmases that we spent together with our little dears. Alas, will the good old times ever return again? And you and I and our little ones dwell together in peace? I hope so. I believe so. But the heart sickens with the deferred hope." There was a resolve that the war would end and Christmas would again be at home and with family and loved ones. Fredericksburg made Confederates hope that the end would come sooner rather than later. William H. Cock of the 9th Virginia Infantry, Burnside's defeat will doubtless tend to bring the war to a close sooner rather than the otherwise. Oh, he was beautifully whipped. Richard Lewis, 5th South Carolina. I think if many more engagements with them are as destructive as this last one, it will bring the war to a close rather swiftly. Brigadier General Cadmus Marcellus Wilcox. I feel indeed that heaven is on our side and that we have a bright and happy future before us. I honestly believe the war is near its end. George Hilliard, 9th Georgia Infantry. They were Burnside's best troops, and their defeat made the others worse. I am far more buoyant and hopeful of the future than ever before. But then there was the unsettling news that one Union Army did not fall in defeat at Murfreesboro or Stones River, Tennessee. And it seemed like the task here in Virginia just got a little harder. Major Henry McDaniel, 11th Georgia Infantry. Every defeat in the West makes for us another battle. We beat the enemy in Virginia, and he beats our armies in the West. And so it goes on. Christmas 1862 was a challenge, clearly. But the war dragged on, and Christmas in 1863 and in 1864 would be even more difficult to reconcile emotionally for the soldiers and the civilians in the North and the South. In a time of uncertainty and fear, family ties and community rituals became even more important. Where they had hidden themselves and had been reflective so that they did not upset mourners, things turned around. They went the exact opposite direction. They needed celebration. They needed holidays. Soldiers and civilians, families and friends found solace and hope in the tradition, old and new traditions. They dwelled on peace and love and acceptance at a time of war and turmoil and death. So it was important to bring community together. As they had lost members of their community, those that were left needed to have a tighter bond between them. During the Grant administration, Christmas became an official federal holiday in 1870. The Civil War transformed a private religious celebration into a public expression, and from a loose celebration to an essential celebration. From one that celebrated one's own family to one celebrating one's own community. From one that celebrated a religious overtone to one that celebrated the benefit that it could bring mankind. And that's why so many people gather at this time of the year. Not only to surround themselves with family and friends, but community. And gather. But not unlike how we gather tonight. In a beautiful setting, truly evocative. A spot that probably was filled in the 1862, 63, 64 period. With people trying to make sense, but also trying to connect. And maybe in the world today, 160 plus years later, things aren't that much different. And that this is still something that people set aside as a special time of year, where people treat each other just a little kinder, or a little bit more patient. They smile easier. And it's something that we almost wish could go on for another 11 months. But this is a time to find peace with the people around you and the peace in yourself. And it was the Civil War generation that were able to teach us that. So that is the holidays during the Civil War. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts or ideas, or just want to rail at me for going too long? Yes?
You had mentioned Christmas or focus on Christmas. What about Thanksgiving at that time? Was it more pervasive or more common?
Thanksgiving was kind of a moving gradient, and Thanksgiving had different expression to it. There were those that believed that it was, in fact, a family gathering, not unlike what we would see today, with the gathering of the harvest and the celebration of that. But there were also those that, as the war went on, and we had replaced big cotillions with starvation parties, Thanksgiving was a time of now sacrifice and reflection, to not have anything to excess was considered more patriotic. So those expressions did change. But for them, I didn't see nearly as big a footprint of discussion as I heard from the voices of these people over the December holiday period. They were soldiers from all sorts of walks of life, and all different faiths. So even as we talked about them, there were those that celebrated this occasion, this period, differently than each other. But they still wound up celebrating together. It wasn't odd to have James Longstreet celebrating with Raphael Moses, a member of his staff. And Longstreet would eventually become Roman Catholic, And Raphael Moses was a Jewish man. But to them, this period of time is that special period of reflection for everyone, which is tremendously unifying in one sense. But when there's a common enemy that's gone, so often we find ourselves looking at our differences rather than our similarities. And that's how things have a tendency to become fractious and fractured. But there's far more people in the world who want to see the good in people than don't. We just don't hear about them on the nightly news. Because being good people isn't newsworthy. It's not sensational, but also it's the fact that you're the majority. So it shouldn't be something new. It probably would be startling to some people, but maybe they do need to be exposed more to that. We've taken goodwill for granted. That way. So, yes.
I read that a lot of slaves would use the Christmas period to try to make an escape. Is that correct?
The notion that a lot of the enslaved people would take advantage of the Christmas period to escape to freedom. A lot of freedom seekers were going to take advantage of that. It's one of the only times of the year that enslaved people have mobility. They're allowed to leave the plantation. They're allowed to go to a specific appointed designation, or designated point, I should say, that is all predicated on they have to have the permission of the enslaver. The slave owner has to write them a pass saying that who this is, where they're going, and for what amount of period of time. That's your pass off the plantation. That's your pass to move along the roads. That's your pass that you have to give to the slave patrols. And in the sketch that we saw of the slave patrol, it was a large gentleman looking away, but giving his pass. Looking away might carry or convey a story. Why isn't he looking at the person he's giving the pass to? Is he upset by him? Is he afraid of him? Is he afraid that surrendering his pass, he might not get it back? And that what little freedom that he had just gotten would be taken? There's a lot that you can read into the art. But I don't want to overanalyze this. What I will say is that a lot of people are not going to be allowed to step foot off a plantation until that period of time when they can get a pass. And when they get a pass, well, that might be their only chance as far as they can see. The vast majority, we're not going to make that run. Why not? Who is going to stop them? Because if you get caught, the law is so draconian that you could be disfigured, you could be sold away from your family, you could be killed. So if you get caught, that is designed specifically as a law to make sure that people are terrified at breaking the law. So it's designed specifically with that in mind. So it's a weird, weird twist. We can look at human beings who are going to get married, or they're going to be reunited with their families who live at another plantation that they haven't seen their wives or children in months. That could be a happy occasion. But it's also recognizing that they've been separated from their loved ones for months and that they need permission to be able to wed. They're not allowed to make those decisions for themselves. The holiday is one that a lot of the Black community looked forward to every year. It was just that 12-day break, the 12 days of Christmas break, that allowed people to put a new roof on their cabin, mend old clothes, and get a new set of clothes. This was a chance to just not be scrutinized every minute of the day. And if there was happiness there, it was well earned and justly deserved. Not only for that moment of respite, but also recognizing that happiness is resistance. It is an expression of being a human being. And in an oppressive world, sometimes being able to be happy is a triumph over the things around them. So, maybe Christmas was also a time of resistance. Even if nobody ran. But there's an awful lot of people that did. That's why you have the slave patrols out there.
It wasn't just revolts, it was also to keep them.
It was to keep them from running away. It was to keep them from agitating. It was you can never underestimate how much slave revolt was on the mind of plantation owners. Plantations have a tendency to be rather isolated, and the population is dramatically one-sided demographically. So there is always that fear, and that's why, again, the draconian aspects of it is that I'm not going to be able to convince you to do what I want you to do as an enslaved person because you love me. So you'll do it out of fear. And fear can be used in so many different ways. Slave revolt does happen. Slave revolt happened in the Rappahannock Valley in 1805 at Chatham. And anybody know what provoked that slave revolt? An overseer cut the 12 days in half and put everybody back to work. The enslaved people were absolutely disgusted, and several of them said they were not going to do it. And when the overseer attempted to make an example of one of the enslaved people, he literally overpowered the overseer and tied him up and whipped him instead.
What was his outcome?
What was the outcome was that a posse from Falmouth came and attacked the enslaved people at Chatham, and 5 people lost their lives. There was one man who probably didn't even participate in any of the revolt, but just simply tried to warn the posse that they shouldn't go to Chatham. Chatham wasn't a place that they would be welcomed, and that they should let things calm down. Instead, they held him. They took him into custody, and when he panicked and tried to run away, they shot him and killed him on the spot. An elderly man named Moses was, Abraham. He tried to be the spokesman for the enslaved people, and when they attacked him, he defended himself with an axe. He actually killed one of the members of the posse before he was overpowered and taken into custody. The person who was supposed to be whipped and whipped instead, his name was Cupid, And he wound up being captured as well. And another sort of one of the enslaved people was captured with him, so 3 were captured. And then there was a fellow named James who wanted nothing to do with any of this, got so scared. On January 3rd, or January 2nd, he dove into the Rappahannock River and swam across to Fredericksburg, just to escape Chatham. Only to find that all the white citizens in Fredericksburg had already been roused by slave revolt, and they attacked James, and he wound up going back into the river and trying to swim back to get away from them. He died in the river. We don't know if he drowned or if he was shot. Those that were captured, Abram was put on trial within a week and found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang. They gave the sentence about noon, and the very next morning, they hanged him. So there is no time to even think about asking somebody to review this. As for the other 2 that were captured, Cupid and the other gentleman who I'm just not remembering his name right now.
Moses?
No, it wasn't Moses. Abram was the guy who was hanged. But the other 2, they were sentenced to hang as well, but their lawyer appealed for mercy, and both of them were, quote, sold out of the country. We don't know what that means. I don't know if that meant that they were sold out of our immediate vicinity,
Or shipped to Libya or whatever.
or they were shipped off the North American continent and into the islands or where. But bottom line is that those people will never see their families again.
So there was an actual legal trial?
There was.
Because I thought maybe the plantation owner got...
No, the plantation owner himself was a fellow named William Fitzhugh, who had absolutely nothing to do with it. Didn't try to participate in the trial, didn't try to do anything until after the fact. And then he wrote a letter to the state saying, hey, I lost 5 enslaved people. I'd like to be paid for that. And the governor had to literally sit back going, well, because you're a bad manager and you fomented this difficulty, those who were executed had to be done at the behest of the state. We're not giving you money for that. But the other 2 died under other unusual circumstances. We'll pay for that. Then you know what the value of life is. So a person like James is worth $300. Yeah, so, but that was 1805. That was a long time ago. But still, the specter of having slave revolt was always real. There was Gabriel's revolt. There was Denmark Vesey. There was
Nat Turner?
Nat Turner, exactly, 1830. All of these things were something that were perpetually in the subconscious, if not the conscious mind, as we go forward. And that's why you're also going to see such strong emotions about the Emancipation Proclamation. Because it also has a part of it that says that enslaved people have the right to fight for their freedom.
Also, what happened in the news from Haiti.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Once the news came up, it was terrifying that could happen.
Oh, sure. What happened in Haiti absolutely is going to contribute to it. Santo Domingo. You're also going to have the German coast down in Louisiana. There's numerous examples that we can cite. But the Emancipation Proclamation, when people like Abraham Lincoln say enslaved people have the right to freedom and they have the right to fight for their freedom, we're thinking in federal service as USCTs. But to every plantation owner reading that, it seemed to be a license for open slave revolt. So the worst case scenario, it was the Doomsday article for a lot of them. Because not only had the federal government said it's okay to rise up and revolt, but we're gonna arm you and we're gonna make it legal. So for a lot of people that were reading it that way, they were highly incensed, as you can imagine. After the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation came out, the numbers of soldiers in Robert E. Lee's army swelled with new recruits that hadn't been in war before. And it was the preliminary emancipation that incited them to do that. So Lee's army went from 35,000 at Antietam to 78,000 at Fredericksburg 3 months later. Now, a lot of it were people that had been recuperating from injuries over the summer, those that got broken down on long marches all across Virginia and had come back. But there was a significant influx of new blood, bound and determined to make sure that the Emancipation Proclamation would never, ever be fulfilled. And that's going to go on to create laws for the Confederacy, including one called the Retaliatory Act. You familiar with the Retaliatory Act?
No.
Okay. The law said that when former slaves or anyone who's African American in arms was captured, they could either be summarily executed or they could be sold back into slavery. But that was all at a local level, so that was by state law. So if you got captured in 1862, 63, you were going to be having your fate decided in Richmond, or in the Spotsylvania Courthouse, or in Culpeper Courthouse. But in May 1st, 1863, the Retaliatory Act said this is going to be a national law, and this is going to be fulfilled and determined by the national government. And the agent that's going to decide it is the Army. So it's up to Robert E. Lee to decide what to do if they capture African Americans in arms. And they called it the Retaliatory Act. They wanted everybody to know exactly what the purpose of this is. It's retaliation against the emancipation. Wow, we really got off the But all those things are festering simultaneously. We have to live in a world that has all these things going. And sometimes it's the challenge to be cheerful in the face of so many challenges. Maybe happiness is not just resistance for enslaved people. Happiness is resistance for all people. Yes?
Christmas 1862 in Culpeper.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that if the Rappahannock was the effective boundary between the two armies, then it would have been relatively peaceful.
Relative is a relative term. There were indeed soldiers who were convalescing here. There was also, in fact, a very strong presence here. Confederate cavalry spends a lot of time here because you are guarding the outlands of the main centers of the armies themselves. There's always the perpetual fear that Union raiding forces will cross the Rappahannock and try to slice in behind. But it's also a matter that you're going to have Confederates doing that in reverse. So this becomes a highway back and forth for raiding parties. Another way to put this in a more modern terminology, we would call this bandit country, where the law changes every hour based off of who's holding the gun at that point. And Culpeper is going to be feeling that both ways. But it does have a social element to it. John Pelham is falling in love, so that's going to be newsworthy right there. So,
How many times?
well, how many times is a good question, but he's really sweet on a girl in Culpeper that he's going to be visiting as late as March 17th, 1863.
Untimely demise.
Right. There's a social element to it, but there's a paucity to it. The people around Culpeper County have armies constantly going back and forth through their midst. Their fields are a mess. Their crops have been destroyed. Making a go of it is going to be challenging. The people of Fredericksburg, in one sense, may have actually had it easier. With their homes destroyed, they had to go somewhere else. But the people of Culpeper, how much do you lose? How much do you endure before you can't? Before you have to leave? Fredericksburg at least has a cutoff moment where you're either in or you're out, but they all go together. There's support in that. Culpeper, people leave in small groups, in cells, 2 at a time, 10 at a time. The labor force here is all but gone. The enslaved people have sought freedom as soon as they could, recognizing that well before emancipation, that wherever the Union Army is, that's not where the Confederates are, so that's where freedom might lie. There is no guarantee that you're going to be welcomed. There's no guarantee that they're not going to send you back. But it's an estimate of over 10,000 enslaved people made the trek across the Rappahannock just to get into Union lines. And that means it's stripping down Spotsylvania County, it's stripping down Culpeper County, it's stripping down Orange County, Louisa County, Caroline County, and even further south. There are those from Richmond that make that exodus. And when we talk about 10,000, it's a number that's been quantified in the sense that the person who was the chief agent of the U.S. military railroads with the Union Army presence in Falmouth was asking if there was some way that they could come up with rolling stock or cars to handle at least 10,000 former slaves. So we don't know what the number was, but we always hover around that 10,000 because the railroad was looking for just that kind of amount to transport.
Where are they gonna transport them to?
Probably to Alexandria, and from there you can go wherever you might. An awful lot of enslaved people didn't want to leave. It's not that they didn't want to leave the plantation. Some of them didn't because they were married, they had children, they were responsible. They couldn't leave them and they couldn't all go. There were those that didn't want to leave because their loved ones were at other plantations in the other direction. And that meant that they'd probably be cut off forever. There were those that didn't want to leave because they didn't think they had to leave. There was a plantation just outside Fredericksburg called Bell Hill. And there was a young African-American lady who worked in the house, but she deliberately went out of her way to break everything that she touched. She always got whatever she was supposed to do wrong, and she did it on purpose. And didn't even try to hide that fact. To the point where the lady of the plantation became so exasperated, she told her to leave. And the answer she got is, I don't have to. Because any of us who have seen the signs know that Moses is coming and that slavery's dead. So I don't have to leave. I can be free right here. It's a rarity for somebody to think that way, but it is powerful to think that way. There was an awful lot of African Americans who wanted to not leave in the sense that they didn't want to leave the Union Army. The Union Army was the first place in the world where white people welcomed them. In many cases, even treated them nicely. Not necessarily as equals, but some did. And that was different. But they also were provided with a means of a job. They could work for the Army. They could be teamsters. They could be wagon masters. They could be cooks. They could be valets. They could take care of the horses of the officers and make a little bit of money. That's the first time that they've ever made decisions for themselves on what they would do and get paid for it. That's pretty exciting and very exotic. And then when the Emancipation came out and said that African Americans can now actually fight, it's startling how many joined up immediately. All up and down the Rappahannock Valley, there's former enslaved people that are going to be joining right away. The 23rd U.S. CTs is almost exclusively the Rappahannock Valley. So these units, some of them are going to see some hard service. And the exciting thing for them is that they got paid. So when you're eating lousy food and doing the torturous marches and getting shot at, you're getting all the exact same experience as the white soldier. How egalitarian is that?
Just not getting paid.
You're not getting paid as much, but you're getting paid. And after the war, you can even have a pension. And that is mind-blowing to people. There was one enslaved person named Charles Sproul that I thought was really interesting. He did all this. He ran away in April 1862 when he met a cavalry officer who just simply said, "You want to be free?" And he said, "I followed him." He wasn't allowed to join the army, so he took care of wagons for the 1st New Jersey Cavalry. When the Emancipation came out, he joined up right away. He didn't see much fighting. He was down around Fort Monroe, but his health was completely crushed in the swampish area down around Fort Monroe. But after the war, he had created a nest egg. He could buy his own farm. But what I love about Charles Sproul is that he didn't just go off to go buy a farm. He decided to buy a farm in the wilderness within eyesight of where he had been enslaved by the Lacey family. Because now it wasn't Lacey's land, it was his. And he could decide what would be grown on that land. And he could decide what the price of that would be. And he got a pension because his health had been broken. And he lived until 90. And is buried in the National Cemetery in Fredericksburg. Another thing that maybe a white soldier would have taken for granted, but for a black soldier, that was a great, incredible privilege. They were buried with white soldiers. Equal in death. And then it doesn't matter what the pay difference was. So I have to admit, I found a lot of soldiers who did that. And a lot of them are buried now in Arlington and other national cemeteries. But this one always appealed to me because he insisted on buying a farm within eyesight of where he had been enslaved. It was almost as if he was flaunting his present against his past. You gotta love that. That's a great human spirit. Again, we found ourselves in this rather remarkable discussion. I'm not sure how that happened.
And with Lee at the latter part of the war, he did consider seriously raising black infantry.
Oh, yeah, yeah. The idea of having enslaved people fight for the Southern Confederacy and be awarded their freedom was a consideration that had been promoted with several generals, actually starting out west and then coming east later in the war. It never got past the discussion phase. In fact, even those that would discuss it were often alienated by their brother officers. It was considered treason to talk in such terms. Because the cornerstone of the government that was perpetuated in Richmond, according to the vice president himself, is the perpetuation of slavery. And granted, when you're in 64 and 65, and the question is, how long do you hang on to ideals? Or how many have to be sacrificed just to survive? The question is, do you go down idealistically? Or do you sell out your ideals and then you make amends later on if you survive? These are questions that haunt every generation of people around this globe who are enduring war. Because war is not the great moral leveler. So that's always going to make it really tough. War is a disastrous, overwhelming thing. That's why soldiers are the most unique beings on the face of the earth. Because they are the only people that I've ever met that their whole purpose of being is to find themselves unemployed. Because they know what the consequence is.